We know that Plato, too, was not averse to using allegories and analogies to explain enigmatic phenomena when philosophical arguments could not be provided. The myth of the cave obviously relied heavily on the analogous relations between the warmth and light of our sun and the form of the good, the virtuous life. We remember, too, that it was in the Republic that Socrates rebuked Homer for his poetic representation of the gods as deceitful, unjust, and prone to immoral behavior. These gods, for Socrates, were not manifestations of the form of the good proposed by Plato in his theory of forms, but many interpretations of the intentions of Homer are possible, including the possibility that he favored certain elements of the previous pantheon of impersonal deities/forces such as the demiurge, the Erinyes/Eumenides, etc., over the new pantheon. The last act of Socrates was a request to a friend to make a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of medicine, presumably as thanks for the relatively painless experience of being poisoned to death. This indicates that some of the gods, especially those connected with knowledge and leading a good-spirited, flourishing life, were admired by Socrates. We also ought to recall in this context that the early career of Socrates was spent as a so-called natural philosopher, investigating the physical world and its elements. Socrates himself attributes to Anaximander's claim that all is mind, noos, the inspiration for the turn away from this kind of physical investigation and toward the investigation of the human sush, its powers of virtue and vice. This Socratic turn at the very least mitigated the accusations directed at him for being an atheist, a rumor that may have aided in his unpopularity with a large part of the jury that considered the accusations leveled against him. Firstly, of denying the value of the gods of the polis, and secondly, of corrupting the minds of the youth. Anaximander claimed, as we know, that the moon is made of stone, and perhaps Socrates believed this proposition to be true, whilst also believing in the demiurge and noos. As far as mythology was concerned, Socrates was prepared to consider myths symbolically, but he refrained from interpreting Orphic and other mythological images literally, and as we have mentioned, objected to the Homeric images of the Greek gods behaving immorally. There was probably no clear distinction in the minds of the ancient Greeks between religion and mythology, as there is for the modern understanding that we find in the work of Freud, for example. Freud would, in his later works, produce a theory with implications for both mythology and religion, in which he cautioned against embracing pathologically originated images of figures related to, for example, the Oedipus complex. We ought, however, in this context, to recall his positive references to Greek literature and mythology, Oedipus Rex, Eros, Thanatos, Ananke. Freud was also familiar with ancient Greek philosophy, which he actively referred to in his later work, using his god logos to illuminate the many meanings of being referred to by the terms arete, arche, dike, phronesis, and eudaimonia. Part of the logos of the transcendent involved the use of allegory and analogy, which Campbell uses Kantian critical philosophy to explain. A is to be what C is to X, points to a resemblance, not between two things, but between two relationships between quite dissimilar things. The relation of A to B perfectly resembles that of C to X, and what X represents is a quantity that is not only unknown, but absolutely unknowable, which is to say metaphysical. Campbell then produces examples of two Kantian analogies, in order to illustrate how we can, via discourse and reasoning, logos, illuminate aspects of metaphysical quantities or entities. As the promotion of the happiness of children, A, is related to the parents' love, B, so is the welfare of the human race, C, to that unknown which is God's love, X. The causality of the highest cause, X, is precisely in respect to the world, C, what human reason, B, is in respect to the work of human art. This form of reasoning by analogy, to reveal something about the unknowable X, is the Kantian equivalent of the Platonic strategy of using allegory or analogy, whenever logos or argumentation fails to reveal the full nature of what one is attempting to explain or justify. Aristotle's hylomorphic metaphysics could situate God on his pure matter, pure form continuum, characterizing God as pure form, but his readers might be confounded if he tried to attach what appears to be concrete content to his characterization, content such as God is thinking about thinking, and in doing so is thinking about himself. We are, of course, finite beings and can only think something about something, a power which originates in our experience of the world. Thinking about thinking is clearly a higher power which we might expect of a being of infinite power. If God's thinking were in any respect related to the world, he would have to be situated somewhere in that world, and that would immediately compromise the status of his infinitude. Indeed, it is this relation of infinite being to the temporal which myth attempts to show in its images, metaphors, allegories, and analogies. Such images immediately bring with them the effect connected to awe and wonder, which appears to occur more readily once we are prepared to discard our own selfish desires and fears. Campbell points out that insofar as we can speak meaningfully about this highest or first cause, it can only be done in the metaphorical mode of as if. This is best done, he argues, via a psychologically effective image transparent to transcendence. Campbell further elaborates upon this position by claiming that the Lord's Prayer, which begins, Our Father, is a metaphorical invocation, given the fact that we know we are not addressing a parent of ours, any male parent, or indeed any specific human being. Therefore, Campbell argues, this prayer's impact is primarily psychological, especially given the fact that it is not embedded in any network of concepts and judgments, but at best inheres in a system of parent-child sentiments. The prayer, of course, also contains a confession of our sins, and a request for forgiveness, which Freud may well have claimed has a cathartic value in relation to the fear we all feel for the consequences of our actions. The reference to heaven in the prayer is of course not a real location designation, but rather a term which designates a metaphorically constituted morphogenetic field, to use Campbell's expression. Campbell insightfully presents the hypothesis that there might have been a Lord's Prayer that began, Our Mother, : We ought to recall in the context of this discussion that the Greek oracles were predominantly female. It would not stretch the powers of the imagination too far to conceive of a prayer to these oracles, who thought that everything created by humans is destined for ruin and destruction, and every human, therefore, had a responsibility to know thyself. Campbell also notes the fact that ferocious wars have been fought over what he calls tribal literal interpretations of the meaning of their own locally conceived deities. The local deity was taken to be a fact of universal significance which, if ignored, proved that we are dealing with fundamentally irrational beings. Whereas, what in fact was occurring, was combat over different metaphorical interpretations of one and the same transcendental X. Aristotle's first philosophy, metaphysics, was groundbreaking in that it provided us with the first panoramic view of the world that was based on pure reason and science, but was also in accord with the knowledge we possessed of Dyke, Archie, Logos, and Episteme. As we have seen, God was interpreted in terms of this Aristotelian hylomorphic framework, and the thought that men might fight over different secular philosophical interpretations of being would have caused amusement amongst the followers of Aristotle. For hylomorphism and critical philosophy, claiming that the tentative characterizations of the transcendental X that is in itself is absolutely unknowable, would merely reveal that one did not know what episteme, knowledge or science, was in its nature. Unfortunately, Europe in particular has been, at various points in its history, transformed into killing fields because of a lack of knowledge of political science and ethics. Secular wars such as we have witnessed seem to have been provoked for more secular reasons, relating to national boundaries and ideologies rather than whose God was the true God. Campbell, in explaining the contrast between metaphor, allegory, and fact, points to symbols, e.g. the moon as the power of life, and the sun as the transcendental eternal energy/light of knowledge and consciousness. The moon symbolizes life because of the allegory with the life of a man, waxing and waning, until a new moon/life begins the process all over again. On the 15th night of the new moon, Campbell claims, when the moon is full, the waning process begins. The denotation of this symbolism is that of a life as measured by the Bible, namely, 70 years and 10, which reaches its zenith at 35 years before the life-waning processes begin to take effect. It is at this point in man's maturity that the light/energy of his consciousness/knowledge is at its peak, and identification with the transcendental X in our lives can occur. Once this occurs, Campbell argues we can regard a part of ourselves, noos, as consubstantial with this transcendental X, which does not belong to the space and time our bodies inhabit, because this part of ourselves appears to transcend death. Campbell sums up this discussion by referring to a key thought of the Upanishads. Thou art that. Metaphysical ends transcend death, but can also be represented in the virgin births, so common in some mythologies. The divine being is anthropomorphized and embodied, and thereby enabled to act in our space-time continuum, whilst partaking of the realm of the sacred. Poetry can also be concerned with this transcendental X. The best ancient Greek source we have in the field of aesthetics is, of course, the work of Aristotle. He begins with the position that being has many meanings, and goes on to analyze the meaning of tragic/poetical narratives. Three of the primary meanings of being are connected to the ideas of reason, namely, the good, the true, and the beautiful/sublime, and it is important to understand that we can study these ideas via the three kinds of sciences: theoretical science, practical science, and productive science. The narratives of tragedy may be literally true, or only partly true, as is the case with Shakespeare's tragedy of Macbeth, who was not a fictional character, being a real historical king, but many of whose actions would have been characterized by Aristotle as mimesis praxeus. The play embodies artistic intentions that relate to the transcendental X's of ethics/politics and the beautiful/sublime. Aristotle's views of the function of poetic/tragic narrative are summarized below. Aristotle's Poetics give us an account of the function of the narrative that ties the beginning, middle, and end of the attempt to represent or imitate action into a composite whole. This composition or plot refuses a reduction into episodic point-like events, because the creator is concerned to connect events/actions in a universal manner. The theme of this universality is more concerned with arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time, and dike, justice, than it is with the divine form of logos. The spectator of the drama learns from what he witnesses the possibilities related to a tragic reversal of fortune, from the good to the bad. Involved in this learning process is a recognition that we all get what we deserve in the spirit of dike. This change of focus from Homer's gods living on Olympus to an inner controlling voice was also linked to the Socratic account about Homer and the depiction of the gods as engaging in unethical actions. Essay 2 in Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, Volume 1, Aristotle's Poetics and Mythos, http://michaelohms.org. Mythology, philosophy, and art all deal with time in different but related ways. Tragedy, Ricoeur argues in Time and Narrative, attempts to articulate the relations between time as opaquely lived in our everyday life worlds, and time as transfigured in the tragic mimesis. In the constructed time of the narrative, whose telos is to reveal the true denotation of tragedy, we encounter the death we all owe to nature. The scientist, fixated upon the methodology and strategies of theoretical science, mistakenly universalizes this agenda to all the sciences, which at best sees in tragedy an experimental laboratory, in which hypotheses are being tested, and at worst sees a cauldron of subjective emotions. Such scientists cannot see the relation of our life world to the transcendental X Kant highlights in his Metaphysics of Morals and Prolegomena, cited by Campbell. The peculiar features of a science may consist of a simple difference of object, or the sources of cognition, or the kind of cognition, or perhaps of all three conjointly. On these features, therefore, depends the idea of a possible science and its territory. Prolegomena to a future metaphysics that will be able to come forward as a science. Translated Ellington, J. W. Indianapolis, Hackett Publishing, 1977. The transcendental X's of nature are different kinds of object to the transcendental X's of a human sush engaged in the projects of the ethical life world. In terms of time, the practical scientist is not looking into the past for the causes of a present phenomenon in order to project the future, but is rather engaged in seeing how a future telos of a project is going to determine what is to be done in the present. Indeed, it might even be claimed that the theoretical scientist, in doing what he is doing, is atomizing time in a similar fashion to St. Augustine's division of time into the past, present, and future. Aristotle, on the other hand, presents us with a definition of time which, whilst dividing time, preserves its holistic character. The measurement of motion in terms of before and after. Time, on Aristotle's account, measures objects of motion in a space-time continuum by dividing the time continuum into before, now, after, with a view to establishing principles of motion that are embedded in a network of causes and effects discoverable by observation in either natural or laboratory conditions. The concern of the practical and productive scientist, ethics and arts, does not measure out time in coffee spoons, but rather seeks its phenomenal meaning in, for example, tragedies and myths. The framework of cause and effect is used in tragedy, myth, and history, but in these contexts we are not concerned with observation-based measurements. Rather, we are concerned with the validation of judgments relating to the good, which are, in turn, related to categorical ends in themselves. In other words, the objects we are concerned with in such contexts are ideal objects and ideal causes, connected to our actions and strivings. One interesting feature of tragedies as we enter the modern world via the tragedies of Shakespeare is the concentration on losing one's mind, or losing the balance of one's mind. Macbeth first sees a dagger, freely hanging in the air, when the balance of his mind is disturbed, and as the play progresses he loses more and more control until in the final sections he hallucinates Banquo's ghost at a feast taunting him for his crimes. This, then, is a modern tragic concern, although Plato did alert us to this kind of phenomenon with his account of the fate of the tyrant in his dialogue, The Republic. Both Macbeth and the Platonic tyrant bring about their own deaths by actions rooted in unnecessary and unlawful desires. Mythology, poetry, and philosophy are all concerned with finding answers to aporetic questions formulated by Kant in relation to the four questions he claims defines the territory of philosophy, namely, what is man? What can I know? What ought I to do? And what can we hope for? All four questions are related to the Delphic concern with both. Everything created by humans is destined for ruin and destruction, and know thyself. Some skeptically inclined doomsday commentators claim that all hope is lost and that we are culturally experiencing the last days of terror before an apocalyptic end. In these last days, it will appear that our entire value system has been upended. This, of course, is tragedy dramatically universalized, but it is not clear that these commentators do not have adequate grounds for their prognosis. Kant's critical philosophy claimed that we could, in fact, use both the concepts and principles of both theoretical and practical reasoning to characterize the history of man and his civilizations. We can, that is, attempt to describe and explain all phenomena we encounter in terms of cause and effect using the methodology of observation, measurement, and manipulation of variables in designed experiments. We can also, however, interpret the events or actions we witness as being regulated by categorical laws and principles, ending the process with a judgment on the value of what we have witnessed in relation to these principles and laws. Morality and law are twins from the same mother, Dyke. The moral consequences of a legal judgment that one is guilty of a crime are considerable. During such a process, if we discover that the moral character of a witness is unworthy, they will not be counted on to tell the truth, and their testimony can be ignored. Conceiving of the world as a totality of facts, as some theoretical scientists do, and conceiving of any search after a transcendental X as irrelevant, is an anti-metaphysical stance that has been very popular in certain scientific circles. Such scientists have come to regard all metaphysics as idealism and as anathema to the scientific project, categorizing Kantian critical philosophy in these terms, thereby denying the dual aspect account of explanation/justification we find in Kantian theory. According to Kant, history uses both types of reasoning in its descriptions and explanations of the facts that belong to a particular region of the world and a particular period. Yet it is criticism from this discipline that has so tarnished the reputation of traditional myths and legends, especially when it could not be immediately shown that Agamemnon or the city of Troy actually existed. There does not appear to be any obvious search for a transcendental X in historical texts, even if such an X is clearly referenced in both ethical and religious texts. We have previously argued in earlier essays, reviewing Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, that history is transscientific, concerned with at least two types of science, and also connected intimately with the major thesis of Aristotle's metaphysics, which is, all men desire to know, and the major thesis of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, namely, all human activity strives for the good. We know that, in spite of the Aristotelian essence-specifying definition of man being rational animal capable of discourse, rationality per se was only a potentiality for man. History, therefore, would have as its major theme the attempt of the human species to collectively become rational in a hylomorphic actualization process. History, up to this point, has been principally a history of our desires and fears, an important aspect of the project Know Thyself, set for man by the Delphic oracle. It is difficult, sometimes, to disentangle the mythical from the historical content of the Bible, which Campbell claims is charting the fall of man from the grace of God. This is a complicated agenda. Mythologically, the fall is related to the separation of heaven and earth, where the consciousness of an eternal presence is represented as lost and the mind and spirit of mankind is trapped in the phenomenal realm. He refers to the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, in which God claims that he is everywhere, spread upon the earth, and man does not see it. We dwell, Campbell claims, in two worlds simultaneously, which are symbolized by the illuminated temporal moon and the eternally burning sun. This abyss between the world of the divine and man was the reason, it is argued, that the Christian God sent his Son to earth to save mankind, an embodied presence in the phenomenal realm that both originates from and returns to the realm of the transcendental X, the sacred eternal realm of forms. In the Gnostic tradition, the kingdom of heaven is not only all around you, but also within. It is in this context that we ought to understand the Hindu proclamation, "Thou art that." Campbell argues that man has closed himself up in his cave, and this takes us back to the famous Platonic myth of the cave, where it is required that man find his way out to the sacred light and warmth of the sun, which is an allegory of that transcendental X, the form of the good. Campbell, however, prefers the allegory that originates from the Upanishads. So the light of the moon, A, is to the light of the sun, B, as is moral life, C, to the lives of all around me are to that Atman Brahma, X, which is absolutely beyond all name, form, relation, and definition. This example uses the metaphysics of nature to picture the moral relation, and thereby subsuming the physical world of nature under the moral world of the spirit. There is no doubt that there are aspects of both worlds that awaken awe and wonder in man, but here Kant's approach whereby the awe and wonder is directed at the power of a great waterfall, or storm at sea, appears more convincing and illuminating, especially if one believes the experience of the sublime is a key experience insofar as access to the transcendental X is concerned. Calling upon Kant only to set his reasoning on this topic aside requires explanation which I cannot provide. It would seem that philosophy is more committed to a holistic understanding of the world as a systematic whole than religion is. Our Jewish-Christian relation to the transcendental X of the Godhead is one of submission and anxiety, whereas the Kantian relation to the transcendental X builds upon the moral confidence of an agent who is worthy of our moral respect, at least insofar as the experience of the sublime is concerned. Perhaps Campbell feels that the Upanishads convey a message of moral confidence and respect. In this context, Campbell discusses the way of art, the heading of Chapter 3, and the relationship between the way of art and the way of the mystic, who has no craft, and who recommends a disavowal of the body. I spit out the body. Whether this is a realistic attitude toward the body is, of course, questionable, given that the human body is the origin and home of human life and consciousness. We recall in this context the Cartesian skeptical claim that we can imagine the I without a body, but we also recall that this modern form of dualism was well refuted by the critical philosophy of Kant, which accepts the hylomorphic view of Sush and many hylomorphic principles. Freud, too, would have been highly skeptical of this mystical disavowal of the body, and its accompanying implication that disembodied thought could be the source or origin of life and consciousness. The artist works through his body, with physical media such as language, paint, stone, sound, etc., thus mobilizing the life force and feelings of the body, in the name of the search for the beautiful, which Kant claims is the symbol of morality. This physical process for Freud is a non-sexual form of substitute satisfaction, which he terms sublimation, an important vicissitude of the instincts. Both the artist and the mystic are, of course, concerned with the transcendental X in their different ways, but Freud would certainly have claimed that the way of the artist was the healthiest form of life, and more likely to maintain a harmony and balance of the mind conducive to eudaimonia, the good-spirited flourishing life. Recall, too, that the first principle of Sush maintained that the soul, Sush, was the first actuality of the body, with its constellation of organs and limbs. In the context of Indian religion, we ought also to bear in mind that, in the spiritual exercises of the yogi, it is recommended that we discard the external world toward the end of the meditating process. Whether it is possible to separate desire and its representations completely from a body and the external world is a question that Campbell does not raise. This would seem to be an important aspect to consider, given the title of the work indicates that Campbell is exploring the inner reaches of outer space. We conclude with Kant's view of the sublime in relation to both art and religion, given to us in his analytic of the sublime, contained in the third critique of judgment. Perhaps there has never been a more sublime utterance, or a thought more sublimely expressed than the well-known inscription upon the temple of Isis, Mother Nature, I am all that is, and that was, and that shall be, and no mortal hath raised the veil before my face. Kant's Critique of Judgment, translated Meredith, J. C. Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1973, page 179. The inscription is on a statue of Isis located at the temple. Plutarch's Moralia characterizes Isis thus. Moreover, many writers have held her to be the daughter of Hermes, and many others the daughter of Prometheus, because of the belief that Prometheus is the discoverer of wisdom and forethought, and Hermes the inventor of grammar and music. For this reason they call the first of the Muses at Hermopolis, Isis as well as Justice, for she is wise, as I have said, and discloses the divine mysteries to those who truly and justly have the name of bearers of the sacred vessels, and wearers of the sacred robes. https://Penelope, ushikago.edu/thea/e/roman/texts/Plutarch/Amораlia/Isis_and_Osiris*/HTML